with the University of Georgia. She is the director of the UGA Weather Network, a network of 86 stations around the state which have been recording weather and climate data starting since 1991. She is also our agricultural climatologist for the University of Georgia in the Department of Crop and Soil Sciences. Okay, Pam.
All right, well, it's really good to be with y'all today, and I am going to talk about the weather of last spring, and I'm going to give an outlook for what we're going to expect next year. I picked this photo of the sprinklers doing irrigation for frost protection here, not because it's a forecast, but just because I like the picture. So I'm going to start out, when we look at 2020, we really have to go back and look at 2019 first. And if you remember back to 2019, the whole Southeast was very warm that year. You can remember probably the drought that we had in the fall of 2019. At the same time, it was fairly dry across the region, but it varied a lot from month to month. But overall, it was quite dry, and you can see in the right-hand map there the departure from normal rainfall, and all the yellows and oranges are drier than usual. The greens are wetter than usual. And I should also note on the bottom of each of these slides is a website, so you can go and get updated maps if you need to for your own work. 2019 was the warmest year on record for South Central Georgia. You can see this is a timeline that shows the average annual temperature for South Central Georgia over time. You can go to the website on the bottom to pick your own region, but it's definitely an unusual year. And you can see we've really been going up quite a bit over time since about 1965. And so I expect that trend to continue as things get warmer. And of course, there's a lot of year-to-year variability, but we can expect to see warmer temperatures. And that's going to fall into what you have to consider when you're thinking about what kind of plants to put in your variety in your fields. And so you'll want to keep that in mind for the long term. But we're not going to talk about that today. What we're going to talk about is 2019 and then on to 2020 and a look ahead. So this is the precipitation for 2019 for the year. And again, this is for South Central Georgia. You can see it was a little drier than usual in 2019, but certainly not that unusual. It wasn't in the top 10 driest. And so we were set up for 2020, going into it as fairly warm and somewhat dry, but not really dry. This is a thermograph of what the daily information was at Alma, Georgia. And you can see that there's a lot of information on here, but let me just talk you through it. The green bar that's on there shows the average daily high and low temperature throughout the year. You see it gets warmer in the summer. And then the red line is the extreme high temperature for each of those days, and blue the extreme low temperature for each of those days based on the historical record at Alma. And then on top of that, there's the gray bars, which are the actual values for 2019. And then I just drew in there a little blue line that shows where the 32-degree Fahrenheit line is, so you know where freezing is just for comparison. So 2019 was characterized by fairly cold conditions early in the winter, and then we went into above normal temperatures later in the spring. And so there was some early blooming. You can see the last frost for Alma was right around the first week of March, which is pretty typical. And then we went through the year. You can see two periods where we had record high temperatures, one at the end of May and the other one in the fall, right around the end of September and on into the first week of October. So that was pretty typical for what it was in 2019. If we compare 2020, this is the same kind of graph, but now it's for 2020 instead. You can see that things look quite a bit different. The winter had that very warm spell in mid-January that was really warm. Then we went through a cold period through a lot of the end of January and on into early February. And that cold period lasted really until March. We didn't have necessarily a lot of frost at that location. If you're farther north in Georgia, they certainly did. But then we went to the period in March where there was a huge increase in temperatures. You can see that there from the second week of March, really into the beginning of April, where the temperatures were as warm as they are almost in the summer. So it was really unusual spring to have that really warm weather. And then the temperatures drop back into more seasonable conditions and even a little on the cold side in later in April and on into March. And then we finally got back to more normal conditions by about the beginning of June. And so that was really unusual pattern where we had early in the season, temperatures were much warmer than they were for the month or two after that. And so that is something that really affects the growth of blueberries and certainly an issue. On the bottom, you can see a line that shows the precipitation amounts, and there's a plot, a green bar for every day. The higher the bar is, the more rainfall they got. You see there's fairly wet conditions in February, dried out somewhat in March because we had those really high temperatures and high pressure. And then in April, we went into another very rainy period again. And so that rainy period with the cooler temperatures really affected the growth of the blueberries. Things did dry out a little bit after that, but certainly not a usual or typical situation for early 2020. We don't know yet what we're going to get in 2021. It's probably going to look different than this, but certainly an issue for growing the blueberries. If you're farther north in Georgia, that late period of cool temperatures in April actually did cause frost. So say in the northern half of the state, so they had that really warm period and then they got hit by a late frost, which really caused some problems for those northern growers. Not so much for the southern growers, depending on exactly what your microclimate is, but something that certainly caused problems for the fruit producers this year. Now, if we look at chill hour accumulations, they use this for peaches, just to look at how long of a cold period we have. This is the chill hour accumulation for 2020. It also shows the last season, which was really starting in the fall of 2019 and going on to the spring of 2020. That's shown in the green line there. And then the long-term average is shown in the gold-colored line. And that long-term average shows that last year we had a lot fewer chill hours than we expect over the long haul. This year so far, the red line shows that we're way below normal. We've had a very, very warm fall so far. And you can see there's just a little bit of an uptick there at the end. That's with the colder temperature that we've had in more recent weeks. And so that's a good sign that we're getting back up towards what we would expect this time of year. And you can see the blue arc or the blue shading there shows the range of possibilities based on past years where we have a La Nina, which is what we have now, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we still certainly have the possibility of having normal chill hours or even above normal chill hours, but we also have the possibility that it could be overall warmer than last year. We've got a lot of the season to go yet, and so that's something to keep in mind. This tool is from agroclimate.org, which is run by the University of Florida, and you can pick out your own location for that. Other thing about 2020 is just how wet it was. I showed the daily rainfall, but this shows the average, and the big graph on the right shows the departure from normal precipitation for April. You can see the huge band there of blues and purples and pinks, which are areas where the rainfall was much above normal. In fact, some of those pink areas are like more than 7 inches above normal rainfall. So that caused tremendous problems for people that were trying to produce the fruit because of all that rain and the cooler temperatures. And overall, the smaller graph on the left shows the whole spring precipitation. Again, it really shows that long period of above normal rainfall conditions across the spring. And so that was a huge issue for producers this year. I mentioned a minute ago that El Nino and La Nina are things that we need to worry about. Last year, we were in what we call warm neutral conditions. And you can see this is a timeline of El Nino and La Nina. When we have the red, so the temperature in the Eastern Pacific Ocean is above the line. That's a period when we're in what we call El Nino conditions, where the ocean water is much warmer than average. The periods that are in blue that hang below the line are periods where we have what we call La Nina. And in La Nina, the ocean temperatures off the coast of South America are much cooler than average. And so that, even though it seems to be pretty far away, can really affect our climate here a lot. Last year, we were in on the warm side of neutral conditions. Usually if it's within 0.5 of that 0 line, we call it neutral. We don't call it El Nino or La Nina. And there's really only a month or two where it got warm enough to get above that But this year we've dived right into a strong La Nina. And so that's going to affect our conditions for the next few months. And so when we look at the outlook, looking ahead in time, what we're going to see is that the La Nina is going to show a very strong signal over the winter months. Excuse me. So here we have the outlook for the Enso, El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is the swing back and forth of El Nino and La Nina. And you can see that right now we're in a La Nina. We've got almost 100% chance of having that La Nina continue over the next few months. In fact, it really stays above 50% all the way into the March, April, May period. And so what we have here is a very strong influence of that. We're not going to see El Nino anytime soon. By the time we get to late summer, we might start to see it. We're more likely just to be back in neutral conditions. And so one thing we do know is that there is really no relationship between having a La Nina and having later than usual frost. So that's a good thing. And so looking ahead, there's no indication that we're likely to see a late frost. But we also know that La Nina winters tend to be warmer than usual, especially in the southern half of Georgia and down into Florida, southeast Alabama, and so on. So what we do see is that there's a likelihood that things are going to start blooming earlier than usual this year because of that warm winter. And so that's something to keep in mind. Even if we don't have a late frost, if we have a frost at the normal time, if the plants are 3 weeks ahead, then that's going to be an issue. And so that's something we're going to have to watch for this year. The outlook from the Climate Prediction Center shows that that La Nina signal is very likely to show up. La Nina signals in Georgia, or really across the whole southeastern part of the country, show that the winter is warmer than usual and drier than usual. And that shows up very clearly here. You can see these maps are for December, January, and February, so the winter. You can see there's a very high probability that, especially South Georgia, but really the whole southern half of the US, is likely to be above normal in temperature this winter. And the reason for that is when you have a La Nina, it tends to push the storm track where we get a lot of the rainfall and it brings in the colder weather. We tend to get that push to the north. And so that cold air is all bottled up in the northern part of the US. You can see that in this graph here because it's predicting below normal temperature conditions across North Dakota and Montana, places like that. Whereas the southern part of the US is not going to see much of that at all. Now that does not mean that we won't have any cold weather, because we still get these outbreaks from time to time, but they're probably not going to last very long. They might come in, you might have a few days of cold weather, and then that colder air is going to retreat again. So that's something that's not likely to last for most of the winter. And you can see on the right-hand side, we've got the probability of wet conditions versus dry conditions. With that storm track moved up to the north, what we see is that it's very wet along the northern tier of states, and the entire southern part of the US is likely to be drier than normal. And so that's something to keep in mind. Not a lot of impacts in the winter. Might mean that you might have to do more irrigation if you do irrigate your plants that time of year. Looking out a little bit farther, this is the March, April, May period. You can see that pattern is still there. It's a little bit different. The temperature likelihood of being above normal is really stronger for the southern part of the US than it even was in the winter. Certainly now the whole state of Georgia is showing that it's well above 50% likely that we're going to be above normal in temperature. And we have equal chances for above, near, or below normal precipitation for most of Georgia. You can see if you go down into Florida, there's an increased chance of dry conditions, but not quite as much in Georgia and areas farther north. And that's because we don't know exactly where that storm track is going to set up. And so that's something to keep in mind. And then looking forward on into the summer months, June, July, August, we can see that that temperature trend towards having above normal temperatures still does appear. Now, we don't know that there's going to necessarily be a La Nina at that time, but we know that that long-term trend in temperatures is still likely to continue. And so that's part of the reason that they continue to show this likelihood of having above normal temperatures. So that's something to keep in mind. And then if we look at the probability of precipitation, you can see that most of the southeast there now is in green. So that means there's a little bit of an enhanced chance of having more rain than usual, but it's not really high. There's just a little bit of chance. And you got to keep in mind with these maps, they're not telling you how much it's going to be above normal. They're just telling you the likelihood that it will be. And so that's something to keep in mind. One of the things that we always watch for after La Nina in the winter is drought the next year. And so that's one of our likelihoods. The other one is, you know, what happens with the tropics. Well, this year we had a very wet tropical season. And so we had a lot of rain, probably more than a lot of people wanted. Although there were parts of Georgia that got missed by that. And so they were drier. And we do have some abnormally dry conditions showing up right now on the drought monitor maps. But the Climate Prediction Center says there's a really good chance that we're likely to see some drought development going on at least through the winter months. Again, not necessarily a lot of impacts over the winter, but it's something to watch, because if we start out the spring with dry conditions, then we're more likely to go into a drought in the summer as well. So that's one of the things that we'll be watching, and something to keep in mind just in terms of water use. And also, if you grow other things, pasture, or you put in some kind of crops that require moist soils to germinate, then that's going to be more of an issue. And it might be hard to get some of those things established in the spring. So in summary, some of the things that I've been looking at as far as last year, and then also again in this coming year. First of all, we had a really long warm spell in early 2020. I think that affected the way that the blossoms formed and came out. And then after that, we had a cool and wet period following in spring. Especially in April, where remember April was the record-setting wet conditions in the central part of Georgia and close to the record-setting down a little bit farther to the south. And so that record wet conditions really affected the growth of the blueberries as well. We didn't really have a lot of problem with late frost this year. So that's been a problem in some of the previous years that we've had. This year it was probably more the wet conditions that were an issue. Again, it depends where you are. The farther north you are, the more likely that you saw some of that late frost in April. But farther south in Georgia and then on into Florida, probably not as much. We know that we're going to be in a La Nina this winter. It's already there, and we're going to see it continue to be strong over the winter months. That means that the winter is likely to be warmer and drier than usual. And so that's one of the indicators that tells us that we may go into a drought next year. It also means that since it's going to be warm this winter, we could see earlier than usual blooming this year, just depending on how warm it is and you know when what the precipitation amounts are. And we also know that there's no tendency for late frosts in a La Nina spring. That doesn't mean we can't have them, but they're not that likely. But if the blossoms bloom earlier than we think, even a normal frost could cause problems. So that's something we're going to be thinking about. And then in summary, I just want to say that I do have a blog that you're welcome to read. I try to put information in there about a lot of different crops across Georgia and the Southeast over time. I'm the director of the University of Georgia Weather Now, which I know many of you use when you're planning things like irrigation after frost. Because you can use that to get information on what the humidity levels are. And so that's something that we appreciate. We've had a lot of support from the Blueberry Commission over the years, and that's been very helpful to us as well. And so those are things that I've been thinking about a lot and appreciate all your help and your input with that. So I'm going to stop there and invite you to ask some questions.